I want to talk about why I'm so passionate about community. You know, there's clearly a role for government, and we need to remind people of that these days. There's a role for nonprofit organizations, but I think there's absolutely no substitute for community when it comes to the things we care most deeply about. So I want to give a few illustrations about the power of community and a few stories. And one's from the Ballard neighborhood. How many people here from Ballard? All right, all right. So the first unique power of community is the power to care for the earth. You know, we can have invent all the green technology we want, but if people don't actually adopt it, it doesn't do much good. And I think it's only when people connect with each other in community, when they feel some connection to each other in the place that they share, that they become good stewards of the environment. And they recognize that collectively their actions are going to make a difference. If you just think of yourself as one individual, what difference does it make if I don't recycle? If I waste gas, I'm one person on this huge planet. But it's in community that we take some responsibility. So I wanted to share a story from Ballard. Ballard, at the time, this was 28 years ago when we started the Department of Neighborhoods, was the neighborhood in Seattle that had the least number of street trees of any neighborhood outside of downtown. It also had the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. There was a woman in Ballard named Dervilla Gowan who cared passionately about street trees. She wanted to see trees up and down the streets. So she put notices in her church bulletin. She put notice in the corner grocery store. She put a notice in the Ballard News Tribune, advertising for other people who shared her passion for trees. And she tried to find somebody at every block in Ballard. And if nobody came forward, she'd go to that block and knock on every door until she convinced somebody that they shared her passion for street trees. And then she got that person to sign a pledge form saying, I'll come to a training about how to plant and take care of the trees, and I'll recruit my neighbors to do the same thing. So she turned in all of her pledge forms with her matching fund application, and one day, trucks pulled into her neighborhood with 1,080 trees. Dropped them off at every block in Ballard. Dervilla went and knocked on the door of the block captain and said, the trees are here. The block captain knocked on the neighbors' doors. That day, over 1,000 people came out and planted trees up and down the streets. People felt incredibly empowered. Beginning of the day, there's no street trees. The end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. They said, God, look what we can do when we work together as a community. But they said we still have the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. So they walked around the neighborhood looking for potential park sites. Had a hard time finding them because the neighborhood's pretty developed, pretty built out. But they finally found this old rundown house. Used to serve as a nursery right next to the Crown Hill Business District. It became a problem property. It was overgrown, derelict house, and they convinced the city to buy it to turn it into a park. The city had some open space bond money, so they used that money to buy the property, but they had absolutely no money to design or build the park. So the community did it themselves. Local landscape architect volunteered her services and worked with the neighbors, and together they designed and built Baker Park. This is the entryway into the park, some of the landscaping. There were some beautiful old trees in this park because it used to be a nursery, and one of them was one of those weird monkey puzzle trees with those strange limbs. It had died. They're trying to figure out how to remove it, and then one of the neighbors, who was Native American, had a better idea, and he carved it in place as a totem. And here's some of the detail. You have a bear with a frog in his mouth, kind of a symbol of returning nature to the city. Well, this group went on. The next year, they built a community garden. This is now one of 85 organic community gardens we have in the city of Seattle with 7,000 urban gardeners, collectively donating 10 tons of organic produce to our food banks every year, all built by the community themselves. And this is their most recent park. This is the site of a former house. So to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement, including this coffee table and lamp. And at the dedication of this park, they unveiled a timeline that shows the 14 parks they built over the last 20 years. Every one of them with volunteers. They restored a salmon estuary. They reforested a natural area. They worked with the kids to build a skate park. They built ball fields. They built playgrounds. Incredible. They said, well, this is fantastic. We've made our neighborhood a better place, but we're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they formed an all-volunteer group called Sustainable Ballard. And the big thing they have each year, I think they just had their 7th one, saw you over there, they have music and they have food and they have booths to educate people about what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And the first booth you go to is the on-driver's license station, where you go and you check all the ways you won't drive over the next month. And when you do, you get it laminated on driver's license. It's pretty cool. It looks just like my official Washington State driver's license. Julia Field's the one who's organized this. So she says, I'm going to walk, I'm going to bike, I'm going to take transit, et cetera, et cetera. And when you get your driver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus. This is a foot-powered mobile that's going down the street. It's kind of a Fred Flintstone type mobile. Gets everybody's attention, gets people thinking about what could I do to get out of my car? What could I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This, of course, has created a movement. There are now 67 of these organizations all over the Puget Sound area. Every neighborhood in Seattle, the suburban communities have organized their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. Collectively, they call themselves Scallops, sustainable communities all over Puget Sound. And it all started with Derville Gowan and the street trees 23 years ago. There's incredible untapped potential in our communities. Another unique power of community is the power to prevent crime. We could have police officers on every street in our city. And we certainly wouldn't feel as safe, and it certainly wouldn't be as appropriate as neighbors watching out for each other. This is a story from the Soto neighborhood, the warehouse industrial area just south of downtown. And this is the corridor through which the buses and now Link Light rail travel. First view that commuters and tourists get of Seattle. And it looked terrible because it was just the backs of warehouses covered with graffiti. There was garbage all along the train tracks there. Well, Mike Perringer here, who worked in one of the local industries, was sick about this image of his neighborhood. He had a great idea, and he says, why don't we see this as an urban art corridor? Why don't we see the backs of these warehouses as potential canvases for murals? But he had an even better idea, and he worked with our court system, and he asked the judges, could you offer the kids who get busted for graffiti an alternative sentence where they could come and help us to create the murals? Wasn't an easy decision for the kids because they had to show up at work on time, they had to dress appropriately, they got life skills training, but they got mentored by professional artists. And young people created every one of these murals. And we found that as long as the kids were involved in this program, not one of them reoffended. The problem, of course, in Seattle is you can only paint outdoor murals 3 months a year because it's raining the other 9 months. So Mike came up with another great idea, got a local warehouse to donate their space, and in there they create murals in 4x8 sheets of plywood. Put those around construction sites to beautify the construction sites. The developers pay for those murals, keeps the program sustainable over time. So now there have been over 1,500 murals created through this program, and over 5,000 young people participated. And you don't have to get busted to get into the program. We didn't want to create negative incentives. A third unique value of community is the power to care for one another. I think that's probably been the silver lining of the economic crisis is people are rediscovering how important community is. The very time where people's needs are the greatest, our government, our nonprofits have the fewest resources to respond. People are realizing all they really have to fall back on is each other. In many ways, we're learning about the power of community from our new immigrants and refugees. They understand community like nobody else. They come from places where all they have to count on is each other. They have so much to teach us. This is a story about the Eritrean community. Came to Seattle fleeing war with very little, often working a couple jobs, low-wage jobs, parking lot attendants, working in restaurants, a couple jobs to make ends meet. But they pool all their resources. They form a mutual assistance association to support one another. And they were afraid they were losing their kids to the streets. So they bought this old rundown house in Rainier Valley, just a block south of I-90, a couple blocks west of Rainier. And they went to fix up this house after work, after working a couple jobs. They'd volunteer, and they repaired the roof on this house. They put in new electricity, new plumbing, new wallboard, bought old sewing machines, taught each other how to use them, bought old computers. The kids taught their parents how to use the computer. In the basement, they put in a commercial kitchen. They cooked their traditional meals together. They shared their dance, their music, their culture, their language. And in turn, the young people are teaching their parents English. Been incredibly effective. They quickly outgrew that space, and they came to me and said, Jim, can we get some matching funds so we could build a new cultural center? I said, yeah, but you need to come up with the match, and at least a quarter of the match needs to be from your community. They came back to me 1 week later with $30,000. 300 member households, each putting in $100. These are people who have nothing, for whom $100 is a fortune. And I keep thinking if we all had that same commitment to our community and put that percentage of our resources into our community, we could take it to a whole different level. We have so much to learn. And they're celebrating their new cultural center. Well, here's some of the other ways in which I think communities are uniquely qualified. We've seen over and over again with emergencies, whether that was the earthquake in Christchurch or the earthquakes in Japan or whether it was a hurricane in New Orleans, government can't get out there quickly enough. In times of emergency, people really are dependent on each other, but oftentimes realizing when it's too late. Our very health and welfare is tied to our community. There have been studies that show that about 10% of health outcomes can be attributed to healthcare professionals. Most of it has to do with our economics. It has to do with our environment. It has to do with our social relationships, with our behavior. It's the kinds of things that can be affected by community. Our happiness, our very democracy depends on community, and of course social justice. We've all seen no major social change ever happens from the top down. It all happens bottom up, whether that was the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the gay lesbian movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement. It's all been bottom up. So without strong communities, we can't have social justice. The problem is at the very time we most need community, it's in its greatest state of crisis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Robert Putnam's work, a professor at Harvard University. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, tracking the incredible breakdown of community life in North America over the past 50 years. How fewer and fewer people belong to the traditional associations, fewer and fewer people voting, fewer families eating together. And he cites lots of reasons, and I've added to those with my list here. One of which is we used to live, learn, work, and play all in the same village or in the same neighborhood. And now we've created single-purpose places where we have bedroom communities where people just go to sleep, and where we have malls where people drive a half hour to shop, and where people might commute an hour to work. In many ways, we have many different communities, but in a sense, no community at all because our lives are so disjointed. We don't bump into the same people over and over again. Increased mobility, where it used to be generation after generation, our families would live in the same village, the same town. And now, most people have moved multiple times over the course of their life. And when we're always on the move, it's hard to build relationships. And if we know we're just going to move again, why bother? It's a lot of work. Longer work days and more women in the workforce. Women have always been the leaders in our community efforts. There's less time to devote to community. Increasing consumerism, where people are chasing the material things rather than taking satisfaction, looking for happiness in relationships. Fear in many neighborhoods. There have been studies that show in many neighborhoods that's the number one thing breaking down community, where people are afraid to come out of their homes. And when they're afraid to come out, they have even more reason to be afraid because they don't know their neighbors. It's fear of the unknown. Electronic screens. I just spoke at a health conference in Banff, and a researcher reported that young people are spending an average of 10 to 12 hours a day in front of screens of all types. Less time to be involved in personal relationships. Increasing globalization, decisions being made further and further from where we live, professionalization and specialization. We have professionals doing what communities used to do for themselves. Specialization, where everything's been divided into specialties. So we separated the people with disabilities from the young people, from the old people. Everybody's being organized the way agencies are organized. And it's hard for us to come together as community when we're all in separate silos. And probably a good illustration, again, is from Ballard. I think a lot of you know this story. A woman who lived in this house for over 50 years. A little house, developer owned the property on either side of her, wanted to buy her house to put in a large mixed-use development. She said, I'm not selling. He said, but I'll give you $1 million. And her house is only worth about $150,000. She said, I'm still not selling. My community is worth more to me than $1 million. So the developer responded. In many ways, this is a symbol to me of how so many people experience community these days, where they feel powerless in their communities. They feel that their community isn't being shaped by the people who live there, but by outside money, by outside powers. And how so many people, even in places where there's a pretty strong sense of community, there are so many individuals who feel cut off from community, who feel isolated, who have no friendships. And a related issue is the crisis in democracy, where people are feeling more and more powerless, where people are starting to think of themselves as taxpayers rather than as citizens, where we've got people organizing against their government and saying government is the problem. Every form of government has taxpayers, but only democracies have citizens. In Fremont, they were so mad at one point that they erected a rocket on the side of one of their businesses and announced that it was aimed at City Hall. They declared themselves the Artist Republic of Fremont. So now I've totally depressed everybody, right? I talked about how important community and democracy are and how it's going down the toilet. So I want to talk about how do we rebuild that. And that's why I think community organizing is so important. You've heard a lot about organizing lately. It's been promoted because of Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Newt Gingrich have been some of the main people speaking about community organizing, not always positively. But community organizing is a process through which people who live in proximity to one another come together in a democratic association to decide and act on their common interests. And there's really two different forms of community organizing, two approaches. One is organizing to hold outside institutions accountable for meeting community needs, and the other is mobilizing the community's own capacity to address local needs and to realize its vision. So I'm going to briefly talk about both kinds of organizing. First one is the one I came to Seattle to start. In 1976, I started as an Alinsky-style community organizer in southeast Seattle. And Alinsky basically taught, this is a really rough summary, but he basically says there's two kinds of power in our society. There's the power of money, and there's the power of people. And if you don't have a lot of money, you better have a lot of people, because that's how you make change. So we organized. When the city tried to put garbage incinerators in our neighborhood, we pushed for the model recycling program. When our utility bills were skyrocketing, we started up the Light Brigade and started up the campaign which eventually led to the city voting to get out of Whoops and the shutdown of the Whoops nuclear power plants. This is a demonstration to get the railroads and the city to agree to put in a new bridge to replace the failing Lucille Street Bridge that was connecting Georgetown and Beacon Hill. All kinds of campaigns that we did. And it was largely a faith-based network. Bringing all the different religious organizations in Rainier Valley together along with the neighborhood associations. There's a similar effort like that today with the Sound Alliance. I've spent a lot of time in London recently, and just incredible what they're doing with their community organizing there. They've got a group called Citizens UK that, again, came out of Alinsky's work, but it's a coalition of faith-based organizations, both churches and mosques, that are working together, and they've been incredibly effective. Together, they're putting pressure on every employer they can think of, from universities to hospitals to chain stores, to demand that they pay living wages. Huge effort. And they've got multiple contracts signed with the City of London, with all kinds of employers, agreeing that if people are working hard, they're working 8 hours a day in the community, they should be able to live in their community. They should be paid enough to actually live in their community. So they've been incredibly effective. So effective now that they were able to get a contract signed with the Olympics, which are coming to London this year. And everybody who works in the Olympics will be paid a living wage. And this is how they have so much power. This is one of their meetings. And they were also successful in getting the Olympic Village. It's going to be turned back to the community after the Olympics to be permanently affordable housing trust. Incredibly effective organization. So I just believe very strongly that we'll never have social justice unless we have strong community organizing and strong community organizations. But community organizing tends to start with this map of our communities. It tends to focus on what the problems are, what's missing in our community. And what I'd like to suggest is that when we do that, we're only looking at half the glass. And frankly, we're looking at the part that's kind of the useless part of the glass, the part that you can't do anything with, the half-empty portion. So what's really powerful is to also focus on the other half of the glass. And it's the part we often neglect. Because government, nonprofits tend to focus on what's missing in the community. Because we often say that agencies need needs, right? If we didn't have needs, there wouldn't be a role for government. There wouldn't be a role for nonprofits. Thank goodness we've got them, because we have great needs in our communities that can't be addressed adequately by the community. But if that becomes our only map of the community, we're missing out on these incredible resources, untapped resources that are in absolutely every community. So, and starting with the strengths of communities is another approach to community organizing, which we call asset-based community development. And it's built on several ideas, several different kinds of assets. One is recognizing absolutely every individual in our community has incredible gifts to give. Everybody, without exception. And we like to think about them as three kinds of gifts. One are gifts of the heads, that person's knowledge. Gifts of the heart, that person's passions. And gifts of the hands, that person's skills. Absolutely, everybody's got these. But unfortunately, in our society, we're increasingly putting labels on huge sections of our population that define people not by their gifts, but by their needs. We use terms like homeless. When you think about a homeless person, you think about a lot of gifts. You think about what they're lacking, a home. I have a friend who's a minister in a church, New Prospect Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. His congregation has a soup kitchen in the basement for homeless men. And finally, somebody got the idea, and I said, why don't we interview these men, find out what their gifts are? Turns out a lot of these men like to cook. They said, would you like to help cook the meals in the soup kitchen? They were overjoyed. Nobody ever thought to ask them that before. So after a while, the homeless men and the members of the church are cooking and eating together. It was hard to tell who were the providers and who were the clients because it wasn't about services anymore. It was about community. It was about everybody supporting each other, sharing their gifts with each other. Some of the other labels we use are unemployed, poor person, non-English speaking, single parent, addict, offender, disabled. That one really drives me crazy. How many people in this room have no disability? I see some eyeglasses. My disability is my memory. It gets worse every year. But when I'm applying for a job, I don't say I have this disability, but please hire me. And yet there's a growing section of our population that we define solely in terms of their disability. And when we do, we overlook their gifts. And when we just focus on people's needs, they become clients in a service system. When we focus on people's gifts, they become citizens in our community. And everybody has both needs and gifts. But somehow in our society, we've created two classes of people, those with the needs and those with the gifts. And then we wonder why those labeled people aren't active in our communities. They're invisible. They're part of a service system. They aren't part of our community. So just an illustration from Limerick, Ireland, where I've done some work with my colleague Cormac Russell. And this is the neighborhood his family's from. This is called Ballinacora Weston. It's one of 3 social housing communities in Limerick. And it's also Our Lady of Lourdes Parish. These 3 housing communities have had incredible problems with gang activity. Ballinacora Weston in particular. Really scary gangs. There have been several murders in that neighborhood, small neighborhood. The government solution was, we're going to come in and buy out people's homes, and we're going to tear down this community and rebuild it. They did that without consulting the residents. But one at a time, they started buying up these houses. They became boarded up. They became covered with graffiti. There was garbage absolutely everywhere. And then with the collapse of the economy in Ireland, there's absolutely no money to carry through on the plan. So people are worse off than ever. People are living, this is one of those neighborhoods where people are in fear for good reason. And they're behind closed doors. And you can't build community when people are behind closed doors. But one of those labeled groups, the at-risk youth, we hardly ever talk about young people anymore these days without that adjective at risk. And yet who's got more creativity? Who's got more energy? Who's got more at stake in the future of our community than young people? One of these at-risk young people organized her friends, and on Christmas Eve, they went around house to house Christmas caroling. Incredible bravery. And it gave everybody else the confidence to start coming out of their homes. And so they started painting out the graffiti in the neighborhood, cleaning up the streets. And then a problem property where all the drug deals were going down, that was neglected, that was overgrown, they created a garden of hope. And here they are working together, again, with young people taking the lead, with support from some of the adults in the community. But one of the toughest neighborhoods, and just the power of taking those labels off and releasing those gifts that everybody has to offer. A second asset that every community has are our voluntary associations. These are those democratic organizations where people come together to do collectively what they can't do individually. Usually don't have staff, no budget, like our neighborhood associations in Seattle. When I'm meeting with neighborhood associations, working with voluntary associations, I emphasize the importance of working with faith-based groups. It's a key group that's often left out of our community work. But when I'm in faith-based groups, I urge them to reach out beyond faith-based groups to all the other kinds of ways people are organized in our communities. So here's an example of what happened in Wodonga, Victoria, rural Victoria. This church, there were some members of the church who wanted to start up a community garden on this big piece of grass here. So they're trying to figure out, how do we build the raised beds? So they turned to one of the voluntary association, which is the men's shed. They've got these men's sheds all over Australia where men come together, retired men, and they have power tools, and they get together and they make things out of wood for the benefit of the community. They make children's toys, they renovate facilities, but it's a great way for these men to support each other, to talk about health issues, to get a little time away from their wives. To mentor young guys who are in trouble and helping them learn how to do woodworking, but in the process, being life coaches to them as well. Incredibly powerful. Anyhow, these men built the raised beds for the garden. And then they worked with the Mutual Assistance Association, the new immigrants and refugees who'd come into the community. They got involved in the garden because they were eager to grow produce that they were used to. And there was an organization of elders in the community who got involved and figured they could do things, even if it was just watering the garden. And the crops started to grow. Turned out the church had a commercial kitchen. So they started harvesting this food, and they recruited people to help prepare this food. A local nutritionist offered her services, and they started cooking gourmet meals. But they, again, involved everybody. They involved the high school club that got involved in this, another voluntary association. And they involved an organization of people with intellectual disabilities. They're so proud. Here they are cooking the pasta. So proud to be the cooks for the community, the chefs for the community, to be able to contribute to the community, not just be seen as clients. And here they are packaging the foods. And they serve thousands and thousands of gourmet, nutritious foods to people who would otherwise have no food at all. And it's possible because they reached out and involved all the different ways people are organized in their community. A third asset that every community has is the built environment. This is a picture of Mountain View Presbyterian Church in White Center. And this is a church that has a small congregation. The church was really falling apart, but they used their facility to help support the community. There's an elementary school across the street, so they started a before and after school program, but their facility was really having problems. So some of the people who were active from the community said, we'd like to help you rebuild your church. And even though this was a very small congregation, they had so many connections in their community, and with their sister church, which is University Presbyterian, they used all those connections to organize an extreme makeover of their church. 1,000 volunteers got involved, and over 3 weekends, they totally rebuilt that church. And they put in new facilities for the community. It was a $4.5 million project they did for $1.5 million because all of the skills were volunteered by community members. The local labor unions got involved. They worked through all the different associations in the community. Here they are tearing out this space was just terrible. And this is where the before and after school program was. Here's what it looked like afterwards. This is what their kitchen looked like before. This is what it looked like afterwards. And then they re-landscaped the area around the church. A local artist contributed new stained glass windows throughout the church. And our neighbor across the street took the old stained glass and created a cross for that church. Incredibly powerful when we take those underutilized assets in our community and mobilize them. I know of other churches. I know of one in Indianapolis in a really poor neighborhood where the church was surrounded by boarded up houses, foreclosed houses. And they started buying up these houses, and members of the church worked to rehab these houses, both for church members to start moving back into the neighborhood and for other neighbors to have a home ownership. Incredible underutilized assets in our communities. The natural environment. I was in Leeton, New South Wales in Australia. And there the Uniting Church took the initiative and said, we've got so much produce that's just sitting in our fields and rotting. because our supermarkets have standards where the fruit has to be a particular color, it has to be a particular firmness, it has to be a particular size. And so volunteers from the churches, from the congregations go out and glean the fields. And they're sending thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to the food banks in Sydney every year. Onions and watermelon, oranges. And the local economy is another real strength of every neighborhood. This is a church called Sacred Heart in Minneapolis. They worked very hard. They were part of an Nowinski-style organizing effort to get the police to be more responsive, to help clean up the streets, because most of the businesses were shut down. They were boarded up because of high crime in that neighborhood. But they said this neighborhood's never going to get better unless we can revitalize the economy. So they did an asset inventory in their church, an all-Latino congregation, and found people who used to have businesses in Mexico. People who still had businesses that were operating out of their basement or out of their garage. People wanted to start a business because they made really good tamales or they had a good craft. So they formed a co-op. And you could join the co-op if you put in $1,000 and if you went through a business training class that was offered for free. And they used their money to renovate this boarded up building as a Mercado Central. And they created small incubator businesses inside. Jose on the right-hand side was a dishwasher at the time. But he was elected president of the board of the co-op. But he made really good tamales. So he started up a tamale and coffee shop. And somebody else put in Mexican clothing. And there were cafes, and there's a grocery store, and there's a bakery, and there's smoothies, and there's also a cultural center. So when I was there, they're celebrating the Day of the Dead. But it's been incredibly successful. Jose now has 3 tamale and coffee shops on Lake Street. He's got 27 employees, $2 million a year in sales. They're able to do joint accounting, joint marketing, so they've been incredibly successful. The Somali community heard about this and said, we want to start up our own businesses. So they started up incubator businesses in an old bakery. And then there was a Collins building, which is the former hospital. And in there, they create small incubator businesses from absolutely all over the world, called it the World Market, because it's a very multicultural community. So they're building on their strengths to rebuild their economy from the bottom up. Rather than just giving tax incentives to major corporations, rather than bringing in the big box retail, rather than bringing in chain stores, it's about how do we build on the strengths of our community? How do we get people to shop locally? How do we get people to reinvest locally? How do we build our economy from the bottom up? Finally, every community has local agencies. And agencies have incredible contributions they can make, whether it's nonprofits or government. But if they're going to really partner with communities, they need to make a major paradigm shift in the way they do their work. Because in many ways, some of our agencies are contributing to the breakdown of our communities in a top-down kind of way, in a siloed kind of way, because they just focus on needs and not also on the strengths of the community. So if agencies are going to partner with communities, need to move away from discrete functions to focusing on whole places, on whole communities, more holistic approaches, moving from needs to strengths and from top down to bottom up. So just one quick last story from Neighborhood House at High Point. Neighborhood House got a grant to create a healthy community in High Point. Had a hard time getting people interested. It was the agency's agenda and not the community's. So they said, what would you as a community be interested in? They said, we just want to create an awesome High Point community. So they said, okay, we'll pay for meals if everybody will help us cook the meals, because we just have enough money for the food, not for the ingredients, not to cook it. So all of the members of the community created their own dishes, and it was this incredible multicultural feast that could only be produced out of that community. And then the community said, we could get people here to our event. They wanted to have a big gathering to tap people's ideas rather than just relying on the agencies for all the solutions. So what would get people there? They said, well, if we had some entertainment, it would get people there. So there was a group in the community that volunteered to provide entertainment, and it was the senior line dance group, where some of them actually showed up with walkers. But they were so popular, the kids jumped up and joined them and said, could we do this with you every month? And then we had people sit around tables and create visions about what would an awesome High Point community look like. And then we told people, if you have an idea you're particularly passionate about, stand up and champion it and see who joins you. And so people stood up one at a time. This woman said, young woman said, Chinese woman said, I want to start up a tea house. So we have a gathering place in our community. There were some Somali elders in the corner and said, we don't drink tea, we drink coffee. So they got together and started talking about a tea and coffee shop. This man said, I'll lead exercise classes if people will help me organize those. This young woman said, I want to start up I've always wanted to play soccer, but because of my religion, we can't play outdoor soccer. I want to start up an indoor soccer league. So a group started organizing around that. This woman said, we made this incredible multicultural feast tonight. That's an incredible gift that we have that no other community could reproduce. Let's start up a multi-ethnic catering company. This young man, Solomon, was the most moving of all. Solomon stood up and said, all my friends in other neighborhoods have parks. They have swing sets. I want a swing set. He just tugged at everybody's heartstrings. He was the most articulate. And there were some elders in the corner who said, we do regular exercise, walk for exercise every morning, and we get tired. We'd like to have a bench. How about if we create a park with a bench and swing sets? This was last January. A month ago, the neighbors came together to build that park. Here's the bench, and here's Solomon in his new swing set. And I just keep hearing more stories. There was a group of older women who came together in this low-income housing development and said, we want to teach each other how to do craft work. There's somebody there who did really good knitting and crocheting. She called me the other day and said, we are so proud. We're just shipping sweaters like crazy to Nicholsville for homeless people. Always thinking about who's worse off than themselves. That, to me, is community. So I've got a lot more stuff, but I'm going to stop so we can take some questions and look forward to the dialogue. And if people want to stick around later, I'll show you more pictures.
What do you think in Seattle today a faith-based group like Plymouth needs to do? What could we do?
Well, you're doing a lot already. I'm actually working with Associated Ministries in Pierce County, and we're pulling together an event in when is that? I think it's next month. Yeah, next month. And they're concerned about poverty. And they've been, as a church, a lot of churches working and writing letters to congressmen, doing kind of the traditional things. But what we're going to do is organize a session, a workshop, and talk about asset-based approaches to dealing with poverty, and do open space, kind of like they did at High Point, and have people just stand up and say, here's a project I want to work on. It might be about time sharing. That's a huge effort right now about how can people get their needs met outside of the formal economy. Or it might be about working on a living wage campaign, whatever it is. But really have the members themselves say, here's something we want to work on. Here's how we can contribute our gifts. And it's about I think Plymouth does a fantastic job of kind of supporting services in our community, but also how do we start recognizing people as more than clients, and how do we start bringing them into our community? There's a great project in Ames, Iowa. I figured you could relate to that. Where it's called Beyond Poverty. And what they recognize is that absolutely everybody's got poverty in their lives. For some people, it's a lack of money. For some people, poverty is a lack of meaning and relationships. And a lot of the people with the most money have the least meaning and relationships in their lives. So they bring people together across class to help each other with their poverty. So it's about, kind of thinking a new way, thinking about those untapped resources that are in our community, because I think everybody's probably already giving as much as they can financially.
Okay, next question.
How do you overcome the naysayers in the group that say we're too old, we're too young, we're too small?
Right. Yeah, I have a friend he's a fellow activist. He used to be an organizer in the Philippines, and now he's an organizer in Calgary. He says, Jim, the problem getting people engaged in community is those GD activists. And I said, what do you mean GD? And he said, the grim and determined. And it cracked me up because it describes so many people I know who are always so negative, and they tend to be a lot of our community leaders, and they drive everybody away. They're just always complaining. And there's a certain number of people who go with that negativity, but most people go with hope. So I think it's about how do you bring people together. Sometimes that's why with the matching fund we allow people to create their own groups to do a project. So you don't have to go through those gatekeepers that are such a pain sometimes. And it's about using new kind of calls to people. I have a friend who's a duck hunter. He taught me that every duck will respond to a call. Just there's a different call for every duck, right? And he says too oftentimes all we do is we sound the loon call, and we wonder why only the loons come to our meetings, right? And he says that's the first problem is we start with the meetings. I have a friend who says, why have a meeting when you can have a party, right? Think about it. The purpose isn't who can endure the most suffering, right? The purpose is to build relationships. And you can do that a lot more through fun, through social activities. So the more calls you have, if you have a social call, that's a very legitimate call. Or the project call, because unlike with meetings, there's always a result. There's a beginning and end. There's a role for everybody, for young people, for elders, people with disabilities. The purpose is to build relationships. And once people start to build relationships, then they're more likely to get involved in meetings. I think the other thing is people are feeling really powerless these days. They feel like they've been involved a lot and nothing ever changes, nothing ever happens. So one of the things Alinsky really taught about is working on immediately issues that are immediate, concrete, and realizable, or projects that are immediate, concrete, and realizable, where people can see results. Because if people just feel like it's, so you probably don't want to start with world peace or climate change because it's hard to see results. Doesn't mean we shouldn't work on those issues, but people are never going to work on those big issues if they don't think they can even make change on their own block, right? People need to get a sense that by working collectively, they can make change. And then they'll be more ready to tackle the larger issues. I could talk about that one for a long time. Sound Alliance is came out of the Industrial Areas Foundation, which was the organization that was created by Alinsky way back. But it's organizing's really changed over the last, it's evolved. Alinsky died in '72. And he really focused on organizing people around their self-interest. And now community organizing is much more about organizing around people's values. It's about organizing around relationships, which are also great ways to get people engaged. So what they do is bring in institutions, largely faith-based organizations, synagogues and churches, and labor unions, key organizations. And they start off by doing what they call a listening campaign within the churches, just to get people to really build strong relationships with each other, to tell their stories, find out what their gifts are, what their hopes and fears are for their community. And then they bring people together to start identifying what are some common issues that we have in common that we'd like to work on as a community. So they're working on issues like foreclosure now. They're working on issues like green jobs and training people within their congregations about how to get those jobs. So it's a very powerful organization. It's been around probably 5 or 6 years. But I'd really encourage you to check it out.
I wonder if you'd be willing to comment on community organizers and their value with respect to what Mr. Gingrich has been saying.
Yeah. Well, his comments really seem strange to me in that, as I said before, and I believe it, I think there's two kinds of power. I think there's the power of money and there's the power of people. And money tends to be organized as corporations and PACs, and people are organized as communities. So if you really believe in democracy, if you really believe in strong communities, you got to believe in community organizing, right? What's funny to me is I don't think that community organizing, I don't know why it's not a conservative value as well as a progressive value. In fact, I'm doing a lot of work with the UK. I gave 2 talks in number 10 Downing Street over the last year. They are hiring 5,000, they are training 5,000 community organizers across the country. This is the Tories, because they have no money. Because government has less money. And they say, we've got this great untapped strength in our communities. And they're replicating Seattle's matching fund program across the country with 120 million pounds because they don't have money. So I don't think, I hate to see this stuff get polarized because I think community, I think that's one of the, I have my own politics, but I think that's one of the strengths of community is I think that really is the potential to span across those divides that we've created, the partisan divides, because community shouldn't be partisan. Community is where it all comes together. It should be something everybody believes in. So it's really mysterious to me. You've got people maligning community organizing and praising the corporations.
Okay, so it occurs to me that, like what you're doing is a little bit subversive.
Oh, yeah.
And, you seem like it's, like not a flaming radical or anything, but it is kind of subversive, in my opinion, because, well, let me give you a couple examples, like what happened to the Inuits in Canada, is that, they got television into their villages, yep. And within about 4 years, their whole community had disintegrated, and their kids were sniffing glue and everything. Yep. And and then I think of the movie Network, like, how that,
You're right.
they at one point the guy, he says, go to your window, and go scream out there, I'm fed up and I'm not going to take it anymore.
Right. Mad as hell.
Yeah, I'm mad as hell. I'm not going to take it anymore. And it's like, people don't know what to do, like as if that would change anything if you went and screamed out the window or something.
Yeah.
And so I think that you were talking about how that there's two kinds of power.
Yeah.
There's money power and there's community power, and I think that the powers that be know this.
Yeah.
So do you have any thoughts on this you want to elaborate on?
I don't know what I can elaborate on beyond what I've said. I think, I think it's subversive. I also think that there are people who are in power who are recognizing that there could be some advantages in partnering with communities. That at a time where we have fewer resources, and also that there's a lot of things that institutions don't do as well as communities, that communities do best. So it's subversive, but it also could be a way to create more partnerships between institutions and communities.
And another thing I was thinking about, you're talking about agencies, how that they, look at people by needs instead of, assets.
Right.
And so I'm sort of wondering, over the years, if you've seen any change in how that, say, for instance, the city council reacts to you and to the neighborhood groups, as to how that they might have reacted before.
Well, I don't know about the city council. I think it has been a trend where we've got, institutions have grown larger and larger government, more and more nonprofit organizations. And that has contributed to this trend of kind of focusing on needs, of siloing people. And I'm not one of those people who thinks we need smaller government or we need fewer nonprofits. The message is more about how do we get government and nonprofits to focus on what they do best? Because there is clearly a need for government and nonprofit organizations. There are things communities don't do so well that government and nonprofits need to step up and do. But how do they use the rest of their capacity to really help communities rebuild their own capacity to do what communities do best? And how do we create better partnerships between government and nonprofits and communities by focusing on strengths, by doing work more bottom-up rather than agencies always driving the agendas? And how do we do it in a less siloed way, in a more holistic, community-based kind of way? I think there's a lot of opportunity to move in that direction. It's really tough to move in that direction because all of our systems are set up the other way. Every one of our institutions is set up by silos from the university on up. And our grants are all set up that way so that you can never get a grant by saying we have a great community with lots of strengths. You get grants by saying how terrible your community is and how many needs you have. And with grants, you often have to focus on what the objectives are before you've consulted the community, which is, again, leads to a top-down anti-community approach. So all our systems are set up to be anti-community. I think in terms of council, in terms of government, it's really interesting. I think it sort of depends who's in office. There are some governments now who are waking up and saying, hey, we've got to do our work in a very different way because of the economic crisis, because we don't have the resources, and are recognizing how many resources the community can bring and how important it is to kind of make democracy work again, that it's a real, it's a crisis when people are thinking of themselves as taxpayers rather than as citizens. And so there are so many places around the world now, from Brazil that's doing participatory budgeting processes, to the effort to hire community organizers in the UK, to bottom-up planning in many places in Australia, where people are doing work in a new way because of the economic crisis, and it's waking government officials up. Unfortunately, there are also places like Seattle that are actually retrenching on our community work and using the economic crisis as an excuse, saying we have to get back to basics. Now, because of the bad economy, we just have to do what's most important, and that's paving our roads and taking care of our physical infrastructure and hiring more police. And they've forgotten about community. They think community is sort of this fluffy thing that we can do when times are good, but we really can't afford it in tough times. And there's absolutely nothing more important right now than community, because that's where untapped resources are. And it's a huge mistake for government to just think of its function as taking care of the physical infrastructure. Government also needs to be responsible for taking care of the foundation of our democracy. And there isn't enough attention to that. But many places are waking up and starting to move in a different direction. I'm afraid Seattle doesn't quite get it yet.
You know, that's kind of funny, you know, because, you know, we pride ourselves, you know, that we have such a progressive city council, and we've got people on the city council that ran with green endorsements and everything, and that come from the, you know, environmental community, you know, for instance, you know, but you would think that they would get that, but, you know.
What's interesting to me is I don't think community is necessarily a progressive value or a conservative value. And it really frustrates me as progressive to see so many progressives trying to do things, trying to push their own agendas, and not trusting democracy, not really trusting the people, trying to figure out how do we get more density over on the people this time, for example. When we trusted people and did bottom-up planning, community groups all voted for more density because they were able to shape density in a way that made it work for them. Whenever we try to impose solutions from the top down, no matter how progressive, it doesn't work. We got to get back to democracy. We got to get back to more community-oriented kind of work.
Yeah. You know, this is an interesting point, you know, because, you know, you hear conservatives always railing against, you know, big government, you know, and they're, you know, they think that, well, you know, they're always talking about, you know, how that we should get the church to provide, you know, aid, you know, to people, you know, if they're starving or whatever, which is totally ludicrous. But the thing is that they have a good point, you know, because they understand that, you know, really community and you know, is a big part of happiness, you know. And
no, I think both the conservatives and progressives have good points they're making, some good points and some terrible points they're making. So for conservatives, the good point is, yes, people need to take some more responsibility. And I think that was part of Barack Obama's appeal when he ran for president, was that he said, you know, people need to step up and take a lot more responsibility. But at the same time, he said, but we also need social justice, and that's what the conservatives miss out on. So there's clearly a role for government and for progressives ensuring that people's basic needs get met, that nobody falls through the cracks. But at the same time, we also need to think about how do we rebuild community and help communities do what they do best. So I get concerned that people take such ideological positions and miss out on the real potential for change, which I think is in communities.
And another thing you touched on was the lack of democracy. And a while back, I had a conversation with one of my friends, and we were talking about on a local level, you know, like here in Seattle, you know, how that, you know, we voted for the monorail two or three times. We didn't get it. You know, how that we voted against the tunnel two or three times and you know, they won. You know, how that everybody pretty much was against the stadium, but they crammed that down our throats. It's like, you know, I could see why, you know, people, you know, don't want to participate.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I often argue that that before government starts partnering with communities, it needs to remove some of the obstacles and start doing no harm. In many ways, a lot of the reasons we have had a breakdown in community is because people have participated a lot and they haven't seen any results from their participation. So they've learned through their participation with government not to be involved, right? They've learned the wrong lessons. And it's really tough to be involved with government because in the city of Seattle there's 32 different departments, and each department's focused on its own agenda, pushing its own agenda, and it's in community that things come together. There are enough nights in the year to go to all those meetings, right? And it's not how people experience community. They don't experience them in silos. They experience them where they all come together in their neighborhoods, in their community. You know, the government often complains about, they just hear from the few people over and over. Just, you know, they often talk about them as the usual suspects. But in many ways, those usual suspects are created by government because the processes reinforce those few individuals. And if government is really serious about creating a democracy, it needs to be much more serious about empowering communities, about getting resources, about allowing more bottom-up decision-making, and about using other tools and meetings to get people engaged.
Yeah. You know, I sort of don't think government really is interested in creating democracy very much these days. You know, it's not because of government itself. It's just, it's because of, who runs the government and the power of money these days, that basically democracy is the last thing they want, and it just also ties into
I think that's
foreign
true
policy.
in general, although I think still at the local level, I think there's some good people in government, and I was surprised because I sort of took that attitude when I was a community organizer. Maybe I sold out when I went to government, but I recognize there are a lot of people there who really got into government because they wanted communities to be successful, because they wanted to help communities, they really did want to be public servants, and I think over time they just got worn down by the bureaucracy and by the processes. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to help people think in a new way with elected officials, giving them a new sense about what power is so they don't feel threatened when people say we want more power in our communities, to recognize that power isn't a finite resource. The more you hold on to it, the less you have. Power's like love. The more you give it away, the more you get, right? There's all these untapped resources in the community. And what kind of power do elected officials have if nobody identifies with their government? If people are angry at their government, people feel alienated from their government, if fewer and fewer people are voting, that's no power. The only way, government's going to be powerful is if people actually identify with it. If they start thinking of themselves as citizens again, if they're actually actively involved in their communities and with their government on a regular basis, rather than just seeing democracy as something where you go out and vote every year or two, if that.
Do you feel like you've had any success in this endeavor, as far as the government?
I think it's been... there were a lot of successes in Seattle. I mean, people all over the world are saying we want to be like Seattle. They're talking about the Seattle model, where we involved 30,000 people in the development of 38 bottom-up plans, where tens of thousands of people have been involved in creating over 5,000 community self-help projects. That's the Seattle model that people are excited about. Unfortunately, Seattle's walking away from that model some, but other places are really stepping up and saying we want to be like Seattle, or as they think Seattle is. And so I see moves towards bottom-up planning, matching fund programs, participatory budgeting, all kinds of models being used around the world, village assemblies in India, all kinds of models where people are getting engaged and people are rediscovering, both at the community level and in government, the value of democracy and the value of community. That's what gives me hope. I do a lot of traveling, and everywhere I go, I meet great people who are really working hard to make a difference. A lot of people are feeling kind of frustrated because they're working really hard. They're wondering, what kind of difference am I making? But I think collectively, we're making a huge difference, because it's not just this local effort, but these local efforts being replicated absolutely everywhere I go in the world. I particularly see, with the Occupy movement. Everywhere I go, there's an Occupy movement. I was at one in London, I was one in Toronto, and Victoria. Everywhere I go. And to share those stories from around the world gives people a sense of hope. We aren't in it alone. This is part of a global struggle. And if we're going to make change, we really got to start at the grassroots.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.